position to look at the feather and decide when is it useful and when is it not. Okay, so I'm going to start with the English stuff because that's what I do. So the two primary texts are Ledel, which is early 16th century, and it is clearly designed for a bastard sword. So, something like this, okay? Half the techniques are done with one hand, and sometimes it's not the right hand, it's actually the left hand held right on the pommel, and it's still light enough that you can wield and control it like that. So this is a steel blunt replica of one, really, and this is my fetter, and to be honest, they weigh and balance about the same. Okay, I'm quite comfortable using this thing single-handed at either end of the grip. Okay, and same with this one. And so for Ledel, the fetter is absolutely an appropriate sort of blade to be using. The second manuscript we've got is Harley, and this is an interesting point, and this is kind of what I was originally doing the research that I presented for. Because one of my students said somebody somewhere overseas was teaching Harley as a greatsword manual. First of all, well, it's really way too early to be a proper greatsword manual. Okay, the greatsword is a Renaissance weapon. The Spadoni Montanti didn't exist in the middle of the 15th century. But certainly large, heavy two-handed war swords did exist. This is one I saw on a recent trip to England, in Warwick Castle, it might have been, next to my lovely wife, who is only a little thing, but it does give you an idea of the scale of the weapon. So, I, myself, and most other people have always assumed that this is the sort of weapon that Harley is designed to be used with. You know, something that is clearly a two-handed sword. That is a longsword in the terminology we are using. However, having looked at the manuscript evidence, I'm not quite sure that that is true anymore, because what we see in the period leading up to when Harley was written, in the first half of the 15th century, are not great big two-handed swords wielded on foot. What we see primarily are these things, bastard swords. So even though Harley is not explicit about the single-handed use that you get in Ledel, that doesn't mean that it's not there, that it's just assumed knowledge that whoever was using the manuscript to remember his lessons knew that you did this one with your left hand and this one with your right hand, and didn't bother writing it down. So certainly some more research and more argument needs to be done about whether or not Harley is for a longsword or for a bastard sword, which seems to have been by far the more common weapon in the period in which Harley was written. Next, let's look at the Italian material. Okay, so Fiore. Fiore is clearly for a bastard sword. Okay, this was a new weapon. This is something that people were only, you know, it was still a bit of a novelty for somebody to be using one of these at the period that Fiore was a young man and developing his art. And so, like Lichter now, you know, Fiore really did seem to develop this art, and it was a new thing when he was doing it. But the weapon that was common in Italy at the time is clearly a bastard sword. Most Italian combat that you see depicted is on horseback. Okay, they seem to have been much more interested about mounted combat than foot combat, and so you're definitely going to want a sword that you can swing around one-handed on your horse rather than them being heavier. So for Fiore, again, a fetter, if it's nice and light and you can swing it around in one hand, is again absolutely appropriate, the correct training tool that you can use, and that's absolutely fine. The second primary Italian source, of course, we've got is Vardi. Now, Vardi specifies how big the sword should be. got to come up to my armpit like so, and with a fairly longish handle. So actually my claymore is about right for me doing Vardy. Okay. The sword itself, however, was probably much more like this. So this one is a couple of inches too long for me, but you know, near enough. So as you can see, this is a big sword. Okay, it's quite well balanced. It's actually a really nice weapon to swing around, but it is definitely a full-size longsword, and it's not something that you could replicate with a fetter. Okay, there is a world of difference between this and this. So if you're interested in doing Vardy, then you can't definitely use a fetter and translate Vardy's techniques to one of these. Okay, this is a different weapon, and it behaves in a different manner. And I can tell you, this is a bitch of a thing to fight. This one.
Hugging time is over.
So finally, German longsword. Is a fetter appropriate? Well, first of all, there's absolutely no doubt that when Lichtenauer was young and learning how to sword fight, he would have learned on a bastard sword. And that's what his art would have been developed for. I'll have something more to say on that in the next video in the series, but for now, we'll leave it at that. However, even when you start to get into the early Lichtenauerian material, Ringeck, Dobring, and that kind of thing, even by this stage, the Germans had already sort of passed through the bastard sword stage and moved on to something that is substantially heavier and I would say substantially longer, and really is a true longsword at this stage. Something that is much bigger than what you see in Italy at the same period. And it's a weapon that is designed to be fought on foot in two hands against people wearing some amount of armour. And that is the weapon for which most of the Lichtenauerian material is definitely for. And so in that case, is a fetter appropriate? Well, it depends on your fetter. Okay, these things do come in all sorts of sizes and weights, and you could get one appropriate. You know, you could get one Vardy sized if you really tried. But the fact is, most of these things that you get off the shelf are probably going to be too short and too light to really do justice to Lichtenauer. Now, Silver tells us how long a sword should be, and he says your two-handed sword should be the same length as your single-handed sword, and you measure it like this, and so this one is like an inch too long for me, but you know, near enough. And I find with this, I don't want to wind and bind and all that sort of thing. I want to whack my opponent's sword away and then uncross and hit them and then run away in the manner in which Silver would approve. When I fence with this one, it's a very different story. Okay, so this is significantly longer than perfect length for me. Okay, and it is much heavier. It is getting up towards 2 kilos. And with this weapon, I want to keep it in presence. I want to keep the point forward. I want to keep in contact with my opponent's blade as much as possible, because obviously as soon as I take it away, I leave myself vulnerable. It is too heavy, it is too long, and therefore too slow to be used in the same way as the light little bastard sword. And maybe controversially, I'm going to argue that that is much more like what you need to do Lichtenarian German longsword than this. So at the very least, be careful about the sort of feather that you want to use, okay? Specifics, I have broadswords that are 1.5 kilos and 35, 36 inches in the blade, and I can swing them around just fine with one hand. So I would say that you probably want something substantially larger than both those measurements. And obviously a lot depends on the balance and distal taper and all that sort of stuff. But as a rough guide, significantly over 1.5 kilos and significantly longer than sort of 37 inches. And then I think you're going to get a weapon that is much more appropriate to Lichtenauer and much closer to what people were actually using. So finally, Meyer. Is a feather appropriate for Meyer? Well, yes, because that's what Meyer used. And in fact, Meyer really is a fencing system for this weapon. Okay, by Meyer's time, the longsword had really pretty well passed out of use on the battlefield. Okay, the only two-handed swords that were left were great big Spadoni, Montanti, Zweihander type things. And what Meyer is teaching you is fencing for fun, and not life and death combat against people wearing jacks of plates and helmets. So for Meyer, yeah, absolutely, a feather is right. You probably want it a bit longer than this, but near enough. So what can we conclude? Are feathers appropriate? Well, most of the time, yes. As long as some thought is put into the dimensions of the feather that you're using, so it's appropriate to your sword system. The 2 points that are really important to note are, first of all, don't dictate to people what sort of sword they should be using, what the dimensions should be, because sometimes it's inappropriate. And I say that just because I've come across a couple of tournaments where people have been told they must fight with this weapon. And that is, you know, a bit silly and not really fair, because it might not be appropriate. You give me something Vardy length and Vardy weight, and you know, it's not going to be appropriate for my sword system. And if I give them a short little light Fiore little type thing, that would probably not be appropriate to their system. And so just let people fight with whatever sword it is that they've been training with, because that's what's appropriate for them. The other thing to think about is, are feathers any safer than steel blunts? Okay, once you get a feather that is the same length and the same weight as the real thing, and you have a steel blunt that is equally the same length and same weight of the real thing, is this any safer? Okay, and the answer is no, probably not. Okay, the original feathers were very light, flexible foils for very safe, light sparring for people who were preparing for a life and death combat and didn't want to get injured. Okay, what we're talking about is using them to accurately reproduce the weight and balance of the real weapon, so that we can do our art properly. And in that case, a steel blunt can be designed so that it is just as safe as a feather. You know, as long as it's got a reasonably thick edge and a tip on the end, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. So I only say that because I know there are places that won't let you fight with steel blunts at all, and I think that is also a little bit silly. Okay, as long as it's you know, it's not going to be any more dangerous than something that is this shape, that is the same length and same weight. So that's that. I do have one more video to put up in this series, which will turn up in a week or so, hopefully.